Ever since Shane died, fans have debated how the original Atlanta group would have fared had he been the leader instead of Rick. This very what-if scenario has sparked countless fanfiction stories and heated discussions over the years. Many believe Shane would have led the group better, while others think he would have doomed them all. Now, since this debate is still going strong, I've decided to share my thoughts on how the series might have played out under Shane's leadership, in the absence of Rick. In this analysis, I'll revisit every major plot point and crisis, keeping these stories' events intact as they happened in the original timeline of the show, except that Rick will be replaced by Shane. Even if Shane's choices would logically alter earlier events, I'll assume the plot progresses as it does in the official canon. For example, if Shane's decisions in Season 1 would have led to everyone's demise, I'll still examine Season 2 as if things proceeded the same way they did in the show. That being said, I would also like to disclose that I have no way of objectively assessing how Shane, as a character, would change past Season 2. As such, I'll be basing my conclusions on what we do know about his character, because anything else would be baseless speculation and fan headcanon. Now, in order to make this journey more engaging, I'll be joined by my good friend and fellow YouTuber, Theo Hunt. So sit back, relax, and get ready for an intriguing exploration of The Walking Dead through the lens of Shane's leadership. Let's begin this analysis by magically throwing Shane into Rick's position when Rick was rescued by the Atlanta group in Atlanta. Now, for the sake of keeping the canon intact, as best as we can when doing a thought experiment like this, let's just assume that Shane merely joined the volunteer scavenging team on their mission to Atlanta. So the question remains, what would Shane do given that the group is surrounded by a metric fuck ton of walkers smack down in the middle of Atlanta? I mean, yeah, sure, it was Rick who drew the walkers to the group to begin with, but for the sake of this scenario, let's just assume that Merle was responsible for the Horde's siege of the Atlanta group's position. Can Shane get these survivors back to camp safely? Now, I have no doubt in my mind that Shane would sucker punch Merle and tie him to the roof, in the same exact manner that Rick did. So we can count on Merle not returning to camp, which is an identical outcome to the canon timeline. But Shane wasn't as innovative or tactically savvy as Rick Grimes, which is something I covered in my video comparing Shane and early series Rick. If you want to see that video after this one, merely click the link at the top right corner of the screen. With that shameless plug out of the way, I can say with total confidence that Shane would not be smart enough to figure out the Walker Guts technique. He had been surviving for longer than Rick at this point in the story, and he simply couldn't have deduced what Rick managed to piece together in moments. Hell, he couldn't even recognize the importance of utilizing melee weapons to conserve ammunition. As a result of this, the group would not be able to reach the vehicle that Glenn and Rick managed to appropriate, at least not without taking some serious casualties. As such, I think we can safely assume that Shane would get a few survivors killed on his retreat back to camp, especially considering that he probably wouldn't risk his life for them. He has to be there for Lori and Carl, after all. So I guess we can chalk this up to a fail for Shane. Not a very good start for the fan favorite. With that being said, allow me to now cover how Shane would lose Daryl in Season 1. Assuming everyone makes it back to camp, except Merle, and assuming that T-Dog, Glenn, and Daryl still want to go back for Merle, how would events go down in the absence of Rick's leadership? Well, for starters, Shane would not go back for Merle, hence losing Daryl's loyalty and worsening Daryl's connection to the group, which, by the way, is a big fucking deal going forward. Without Rick, there would also be no guns to retrieve in Atlanta, hence the group would never encounter the Vatos gang. But without said guns being retrieved, it is likely that the camp either gets overrun or suffers heavier casualties when the Walker Horde assaults the group at night. We all saw how Shane would have handled that zombie incursion, and to be frank, it wasn't an inspiring performance. As such, it is very likely that the group would be worse off overall with Rick's absence.
Hey guys, it's Theo here from the YouTube channel Theo Hunt. Now, let's rewind all the way back to 2010, to a time where Shane seemingly had it all. In the absence of Rick, he had Lori, he had Carl, and he had a precious idea to head to his beloved Fort Benning. Now, if Shane had have acted on this idea with our group of survivors, there is absolutely no doubt in my mind that at the very least, there would be severe casualties, just getting to the location. Arriving is also a different story, as we later find out in Season 2 by one of the men in the bar that Fort Benning was lost to the dead a long time ago, meaning the group would have stretched their resources and precious energy reserves getting to a place that was already crawling with the dead. So in the very unlikely chance that they did make it to their location 117 miles away, it wouldn't be salvation that was waiting for them, but instead a sea of the dead and nowhere to go. So Shane's fort bedding idea from Season 1 and parts of Season 2 would have probably got everybody killed.
By the way, I did have a very funny video on Shane's shitty fort bedding plan, but AMC decided to block that video because they don't understand what fair use is. I appealed their claim and they rejected it. And since fair use is a defensive legal argument, there's really nothing I can do, which is why this video is devoid of footage from the show. As a matter of fact, AMC has recently been acting like a gang of limp-dicked cunts, blocking a few of my videos and demonetizing others. So if you'd like to see more Walking Dead content, please consider becoming a channel member. It's super affordable and it'll help me to continue entertaining you. That being said, you can expect future Walking Dead videos to be devoid of footage. I know, shit sucks, but that's just how fucking corporate America works. Now, for the sake of this thought experiment, let's just assume that Shane doesn't abandon the search for Sophia. And let's also assume that Carl still gets shot by Otis in the woods. Without Rick being present, no one can really give Carl the blood that he needs. So he pretty much dies at this point in the story. But that really isn't an interesting outcome. So let's just assume that Shane can give Carl the blood that he needs. The result of this is that Otis must now go to Cranwell High School alone. And given that both he and Shane struggled to carry the medical equipment needed to ensure Carl's survival, it's very likely that Otis would be severely encumbered on this solo mission. After all, he'd be carrying all of that shit on his own. And given the guilt he felt for shooting Carl, and given that he wasn't willing to leave Shane behind in the original canon timeline, I think we can conclude quite easily that Otis would die at the high school's FEMA camp that night, thus damning Carl to an early death in the series. The result of Carl's untimely demise would shatter Laurie's mental state, and also Shane's emotional state of mind. This, however, can all be averted if Shane is joined by Daryl when Carl was initially shot, which would eventually lead to either Daryl or Shane joining Otis at the school that night, while one of them stays back to give Carl blood. If Daryl goes back to the school with Otis, then both he and Otis will return alive. If Shane goes, then the result remains the same as the canon timeline, with Otis getting shot in the fucking leg. But generally speaking, I feel that the first two scenarios I've highlighted are the most likely to occur, being that Carl dies. With there being no Rick, I can also see Shane taking care of the barn incident much faster, which is a positive thing, believe it or not. I can also see him forcibly taking over the farm in a humane manner, merely telling Herschel that he can stay, but that the group is now in charge because the group is the one with the guns and manpower. But when Herschel leaves to get drunk at the bar after the barn incident, Shane probably wouldn't go after him, meaning that Dave and Tony would eventually find Herschel and probably get him to spill the beans on the location of the farm, before then killing him. Perhaps Maggie and Glenn would go out to look for Herschel, but without Rick or Shane being at the bar with them, it's highly unlikely that they best a duo of Dave and Tony. And it sure as hell would be even more unlikely for them to win the firefight against the Marauders. Fast forward just a few days and we would see that with zero warning, Randall's group would eventually find the farm and eliminate our survivors, thus ending the series prematurely. In a best case scenario, Herschel manages to keep the farm's location a secret, but he still dies, leaving no one to train our group to deliver Laurie and Shane's upcoming baby. But if we assume that Shane does go out to find Herschel, which would be incredibly out of character for him, I think it's pretty obvious that he wouldn't bring Randall back to the farm, thus averting any serious problems for the group. And yes, I'm pretty sure Shane could have taken care of Dave and Tony. As for Shane killing Rick, I actually made a what if video covering this exact scenario. It's pretty much my one and only what if so far, but you're free to check it out at the top right corner of the screen. That being said, I don't think Shane would be able to get away with murdering Rick, considering that his little deceptive ploy was uncovered by Daryl and Glenn. The end result would be either Shane being exiled or killed. But let's just assume Shane is able to get away with killing Rick. I don't believe he'd be able to live with himself. After all, he could barely handle capping Otis. At some point, Shane's shattered mental state would get himself, or the entire group, or both, killed. But you know what would help his guilty conscience sleep at night? A patented Manta Sleep mask. That's right, these bad boys literally block out all sources of light, helping you to get a better night's sleep. I was personally given the opportunity to try out a Manta Sleep silk mask recently, and I gotta say, it's incredibly comfortable to sleep with. due to the high quality materials these expertly crafted masks are made of. Just look at how adjustable this gear is. It stretches to fit heads of all sizes, and the eye cups themselves are also completely adjustable. Pair this mask with, say, a Manta Sleep silk pillowcase, and you'll be going to sleep faster than Otis did when Shane shot him in the leg. Manta Sleep also has a plethora of high-quality sleep aids and gear to ensure that you'll always find whatever it is that you need for your bedtime needs. For those of you that want a discount when purchasing a Manta Sleep product, you can get 10% off of your purchase by simply entering the code CAPGOLD during your online checkout. With all of that being said, I want to thank Manta Sleep for promoting this video.
Going into Season 2, let's pose the idea that Shane actually killed Rick in their exchange. And me personally, I truly believe he would never recover from this. I mean, just look at what the death of Otis did to the man. The guilt ate him alive, and just because he'd adapted quickly to the new world doesn't mean he was meant for it. I also think that Rick's death would cause far more of an uproar amongst the group than Shane's did. Shane would probably lose members who were appalled at his actions, as Shane was much more disliked by our group than Rick was. So Shane killing Rick would only put the icing on the cake. And as for Lori, although she's not the best wife, obviously, she would no doubt be inconceivable over the death of Rick, because it's easy to forget, but these two characters do actually love each other. So if Shane did kill Rick, I think he'd have serious problems bringing the group on board with his plans, so he would either have to rule with an iron fist or face losing a lot of members, as they just wouldn't want to be led by Shane. But Shane isn't stupid, so let's say he did manage to kill Rick and hide the fact from the group. Shane would move into the prison, and instead of clearing a cell block for the existing prisoners there, I believe Shane would just flat out kill Thomas, Oscar, Big Tiny and Axel, and in turn that means that there would be no Walker breach during Lori's birth. So not only would T-Dog survive, but Lori would also have a lot better chance of survival, albeit she probably still would have died, but at least she would be comfy giving birth in her cell block bed, rather than in a boiler room. So, if Shane had have rallied the group together and successfully managed to hide the fact that he killed Rick, I do think the group could have fared better in Season 3. But, and it is a big but, if Lori had have died during childbirth, I don't think Shane would have been able to come back from this. Let's not forget, Rick struggled immensely with the death of Lori, and he didn't even like his wife. Shane is obsessed with the woman, so her death would have eaten him alive every single day, and I genuinely don't think he would have ever been able to recover. But let's give Shane the benefit of the doubt, and say Lori survives her childbirth, or he is able to cope with her death, and let's talk about how Shane would deal with the governor. Shane, as we all know, is a hot-headed man, but he's not dumb. I believe in the war against Woodbury, it would be Shane who would become the aggressor, staging attacks on Woodbury rather than the other way round like it is in the show. Which, who knows the outcomes of these attacks and how they would have played out, but one thing is for sure, Shane would have not backed down from this fight. I also think there are instances in the Woodbury storyline that Shane would fare better than Rick in. Firstly, when Rick and the governor meet to negotiate, I fully believe Shane would turn up with the intention of killing the governor. Shane would not want to talk about making deals or trading civilians for peace. He would flat out kill the governor right here and end the war. Also, in the aftermath of Herschel's death when Rick and the governor fight, the governor almost kills Rick before Michonne intervenes. But Shane, albeit, would probably get both Herschel and Michonne beheaded if he was here in Rick's situation, but at least he'd be able to beat up the governor. As we know, Shane is a very good fighter, and I believe he would kill the governor with his bare hands right here. The Woodbury storyline is a hard one for me, as during this whole ordeal, Rick was dealing with the death of Lori, and he still managed to, albeit with a lot of help from Herschel, lead the group and keep everyone's best interests at heart. I don't think Shane would have been able to do this, and I also don't think Shane would have ever thought of the plan of abandoning the prison to gain the upper hand on the governor's first siege on the prison. Woodbury, outnumbered and outgunned, are survivors, and they also had a bloomin' tank on their side. But I still believe Shane would have just flat out tried to outgun them, resulting in far more casualties, and probably the governor gaining control of the prison. But there are other areas in which I think Shane would do a lot better job as Rick, that I've previously mentioned, and the war might not have even reached this stage if Shane was in charge.
So I absolutely agree with my good friend on all of his points. In fact, all I would add is that I doubt Shane would have the ingenuity to save Herschel when he gets bit on the leg by a walker in the prison. And of course, this would have long-term consequences whenever the flu eventually wreaks havoc on the prison group in Season 4. That being said, I do believe that Shane would, in many instances, do better than Rick here. But I also doubt he'd attempt to rescue Maggie and Glenn, nor would he allow Michonne to join his group. Then there's the wild card of how Shane would react upon discovering the existence of Woodbury. Part of me believes he'd be willing to join Woodbury and abandon the prison, if at the point of discovery, both communities are not in conflict. If Shane were to determine that they are outnumbered and outgunned, I also think it's fairly possible for Shane to simply order the group to vacate the prison permanently. After all, Shane has been shown to be a highly risk-averse survivor. Believe it or not, staying at the prison is not necessary for survival. Plainly stated, there are many ways things can play out, while still keeping Shane in character. Be that as it may, I believe that the first half of Season 4 would remain the same, minus the inspirational, "we can all live together" speech. I don't see how Shane can really have a meaningful impact on the pandemic fighting effort, assuming Herschel is still around to handle the mess. And when the governor returns, rolling up with a dummy-thick tank, I doubt there's anything he could do to avoid the same exact outcome we saw in the canon timeline. Now, my good friend Theo thinks he can take on Philip in a fistfight, but I'm personally more agnostic on the result of such a matchup. The governor was a physical fucking monster on the show, so who fucking knows? That said, this ain't a power scaling video. Regardless of that fact, I don't see how Shane does anything that can salvage the prison at that point in the story. Once again assuming that the story's plot and structure remains intact, I think it would be safe to presuppose that Shane would handle the Claimers in an identical manner to that of Rick Grimes. I think Shane would also head to Terminus, thus eventually being captured in the same way that Rick and co were captured. And after being saved by Carol, I doubt that Shane would set a trap for the Terminites, thus leaving the area whenever him and the group were safe to do so. Shane isn't like Rick. Rick was not only vindictive, but he felt that Gareth and his people didn't deserve to live because they'd, quote, do this to anyone. In Rick's mind, he was actually doing a service to the rest of humanity by killing them. But here's a more interesting question. Would Shane go with Abraham to DC? Probably. I mean, he did want to trek 100 miles to Fort Benning, so he'd probably be eager to look for and find any form of safety and or salvation. He sure as hell would not look for Beth, however, which would probably cause a schism within the group. But assuming he does go to Grady Memorial Hospital, I think Shane would raid the damn place. Instead of taking the diplomatic approach that Rick took, Beth might survive as a result of this. Or she, and more members of our group, could probably die. Who fucking knows? But what I am certain of is the fact that Shane wouldn't fight Dawn for Noah. He'd grab Beth, let Noah be returned to the Grady cops, and move on, which ironically would lead to Beth surviving. And when we're first introduced to Aaron, I think Shane would behave in a similar manner to that of Rick. So eventually, we'd see the group arrive at Alexandria. Do I have to really say it? Yes, like Rick, Shane would indeed go after Jessie. I mean, just look at how attractive she is. Plus, it's quite clear that Rick and Shane share similar tastes in women, if you know what I mean. Although I think he'd outright kill her abusive husband. He sure as hell wouldn't try to make things work either with the community. Shane would definitely attempt to forcibly take over Alexandria, which is something Rick was considering as well. And I do think that Shane would manage to successfully pull off a hostile takeover of the community. But this would lead to many problems down the road. For example, instead of Spencer and a few cowards wanting Rick gone, Shane would likely have all of the Alexandrians actively plotting to kill or exile him and the rest of the group. A hostile takeover would also definitely lead to at least one death for our group in the ensuing conflict. I also think that Shane wouldn't be savvy enough to deduce a solution to the Walker Quarry problem. If anything, he'd probably side with just ignoring the problem as a whole, as he'd viewed the problem as being too large to overcome. Which means Shane would be present to lead a successful defense against the wolves. But at some point, those walkers would be a problem. The walls would eventually be breached, and I don't think Shane has it in him to lead the group in the same manner Rick did, thus eventually leading to a premature series finale. Assuming that Shane somehow handles the wolves and the Walker Horde, I think it'd be safe to assume that Shane wouldn't take too kindly to Jesus taking his shit. I doubt he'd bring him back to Alexandria as well, leading to the group never finding the kingdom. Which is kinda bad because Alexandria would be experiencing a food shortage right when the Saviors eventually find them and subjugate them. But if we just grant that Shane would allow Jesus to introduce him to Gregory, I can imagine Shane either taking Hilltop's food by force or simply rejecting the deal when he hears of a group like the Saviors. And to be honest, I lean towards Shane simply calling off the trade deal and simply looking for another solution, striving to keep Alexandria hidden from the Saviors. But unfortunately for Shane, Alexandria would not stay hidden for long. Negan's men would eventually find the safe haven. But let's just ignore that and go with Shane accepting Hilltop's trade conditions. Let's also assume Shane would attack the satellite station outpost like Rick did. Just imagine that all of these events unfold as they did in the show. How would Shane handle the infamous lineup? Given his emotional impulsiveness, and given that he's the group's leader in this scenario, I can see Shane to be the one punching Negan, just as Daryl did. And then I can see Shane getting Lucille'd. But what about the war? Well, that's a lot of shit to cover and I just don't feel like covering it. Long story short, Shane isn't winning the war. He isn't the leader that Rick was. Period. And even with Rick's superior leadership, they only won that conflict because of Eugene.
So, if we fast forward all the way to Season 9 and the introduction of the infamous Whisperers, we obviously have to speculate how not only Shane would deal with these foes, but also Rick, as neither of them were present during this storyline. First, let's talk about Shane. We saw all the way back in Season 2 Shane's cold tendencies. After extracting the information from Randall, he was adamant on having him killed. And I believe Lydia would be no different. After Lydia had been interrogated and they'd got the information they needed, I believe Shane would have probably quite promptly killed her. Unless he found out she was Alpha's daughter, in that case I think Shane would have locked her up and used her as a bargaining chip. Either way, in both circumstances, there is not a chance in hell that Henry would get anywhere near Lydia. So their little apocalyptic Romeo and Juliet story would have never happened, therefore preventing the Whisperer War altogether. Let's say, like previously mentioned, Shane did kill Lydia. That would probably altogether end the war. I mean, hell, the war wouldn't have even started. Alpha would have rolled up to the gates of Hilltop, found out her daughter was dead, and with Shane realising that Alpha is likely going to stage a revenge attack over the death of her daughter, he probably would have just slaughtered them all right there and then, whilst they stood defenceless in front of the walls of Hilltop. Now obviously some members such as Beta weren't present, but it would still take a huge portion out of their army. If the war was to go down though, I do think Shane would be unwilling to negotiate the territories, and much like Carol would go out hunting for Alpha, which could put himself in danger. I can see Shane almost playing the role of hero and taking matters into his own hands, which could result in the man's death. Rick, for me, would not only let Lydia stay in the community, which would probably mean the war would go down as seen in the TV show, but I think he'd try and show the Whisperers the new world that he's been trying to build. Now obviously the Whisperers would be unwilling to comply and refuse to join, but if Rick was the same version of himself that we saw on the bridge at the start of Season 9, I think violence would be his last port of call, as he would do everything in his power to honour Carl's wishes. And although Rick would be unable to sway Beta and Alpha to join the communities, I do think he would manage to convince a fair few of the Whisperers, such as Gamma, to join their communities, therefore weakening their group. So if it did come to violence, the Whisperers would not only have a smaller army, but led by Rick Grimes, our survivors would stand a much better chance. We would see Murder Jacket Rick reappear, which as we all know is the most powerful character in all fiction, and in this scenario I think we would see far fewer casualties than we saw in the actual show.
I pretty much agree with my good friend on this bonus round, so I'll decline to add any further input. That being said, please help my pal get to 10k subscribers. The man clearly deserves it. With that said, if you like this sort of content, please like, share, and fucking subscribe to the channel. Click that damn bell as well if you'd like to be notified when I publish a new video. And also remember that you may opine any fucking time if you feel so inclined down in the comment section. I'm Captain Gold and I hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.